hopefully. Okay, I'm going to take silence as a yes. So thanks, everyone. As Nick mentioned, I work for the Nature Conservancy. I'm a project manager for climate and nature-based solutions. And just before I start, I want to tell you I'm joining today from Sacramento. This is an area that's got a history that's rich in heritage, culture, and tradition. And I just want to start by acknowledging that I'm calling in from the traditional territory and unceded land of the Nisenan people who stewarded these lands and called them home for thousands of years. Just get my slides spin. So let me start by telling you a little bit about the Nature Conservancy, in case you haven't heard of us and what we're going to talk about today. So if you haven't heard of us, we're a global environmental nonprofit, and our mission is to conserve the lands and waters on which all life depends. A mission that I think is pretty important for all of us. And as you can imagine, climate change and related impacts like increased wildfire pose a huge threat for our mission. So my team spends a lot of time thinking about strategies that we can use to ensure that people and nature can both thrive together on a warmer planet in the future. And one of the great strengths of nature is that it can help us both to fight climate change directly by holding on to carbon that would otherwise be released into the atmosphere, but it also can help us to become more resilient to the impacts of climate change that we can't avoid. So today, I'm gonna tell you about this work we've been doing thinking about strengthening the resilience of communities against wildfire. And I don't think I have to try hard to convince any of you that wildfires are an issue in California. Last year, we had a historic year for wildfires. It was the second worst on record, where we had something like 6 million acres of land in the US affected by wildfire. About a third of that was here in California. And all of that sounds like a lot, but if we actually step back a bit, the fire isn't new. It's always been a natural part of the California landscape. Before colonization by settlers, we routinely saw something like 4.5 million acres a year burning, whether it was started by lightning or intentionally by native tribes who used fire to cultivate the land. Oops. But a lot's changed over the last couple hundred years. Prescribed burning practices stopped when native people were pushed off the land. We've seen different changes in land use, logging, suppression of fire. All of these things, coupled with development and climate change, have led to a situation where we're having more severe wildfires more often. And the main point here is that fire is inevitable on the California landscape. So as we think about how we're going to thrive in the future with people in this place where wildfire is inevitable, we've got to think about creating communities that can be resilient against the impacts of wildfire. So the people problem here is really obvious, right? But you might be asking, how is this TNC's business? What is the nature problem? And so there's three sort of aspects to this I want to hit on. First, sprawl is a major problem. And sprawl is actually the reason that the Nature Conservancy was created back in the 1950s. Development is something that consumes and degrades nature, and our entire history has been built around coming up with ways of preventing that. Second, sprawl fragments habitat and interrupts wildlife corridors. And the world is experiencing unprecedented losses in biodiversity right now. With climate change coming, threatening habitats, it's really important that we protect these wildlife corridors and the linkages we have with them. And finally, development in otherwise large intact natural areas constrains fire management options and makes it harder to manage fire regimes within natural bounds, especially close to communities. So we need to be working on strategies to control sprawl. And one of these approaches, an urban growth boundary, is nothing new. These this idea of urban growth boundary has been implemented across the US to constrain sprawl. It's happened in California communities, notably in the Bay Area, but these growth boundaries are not common, and California is still sprawling. The environmental costs of the sprawl are really high. We have habitat fragmentation, degraded air and water quality, increased greenhouse gas emissions, among other things. And so the fact that many California communities are sprawling into severe fire risk areas is certainly not the only reason to get a handle on sprawl, but it might be the most compelling and politically tractable one. In addition, there's sort of this notion going around that reducing the impact of wildfire in our communities is all about how we plan future developments, but that ignores the reality of the built environment as it exists on the landscape today. Right now, something like a third of Californians live in the wildland urban interface, or WUI. Something like 45% of California homes built between 1990 and 2010 were built in WUI. And I heard earlier on in this call, you were talking about people moving into these areas, right? So while we need to plan better for future growth, we have to go beyond that and develop alternatives that enable people to move out of harm's way. In the absence of that, what we see is some version of the cycle on this slide happening in almost every disaster-prone community. Fire happens, insurance pays out to individual policyholders, maybe the community expedites some permit review and a well-intentioned attempt to make people feel better, homes get built exactly where they were, and the community may partially return back to normal, but it doesn't reduce its overall risk. So this cycle of burn, build, repeat is just not consistent with long-term resilience. What we need to do is find a way to interrupt this cycle at the build and the rebuild stage. And here's where nature can really come in to help us. So the idea of green spaces and natural areas protecting people and reducing risks is not new. We've seen from storms and hurricanes that wetlands and active floodplains can reduce flood risks. And recent work has showed the extent to which healthy coral reefs can protect beachfront communities against storm surges, resulting in a first of its kind insurance policy for a coral reef. The idea here is when we protect the natural systems around us, they help to protect us. So as we think about increasing the resilience of our communities, we've got to think about where and how our communities are connecting to nature. You might have heard of something called green belts. In some places, creating a green belt or some other configuration of a managed open space around a community can not only help establish a community growth vision, but can also provide a buffer against wildfire risk. And you're actually looking at a photo of a buffer right now, though it wasn't set up that way. This is a photo of Bill Park in Paradise. And you can see the burned trees just on the edge of the park if you look carefully. That's where the campfire stopped when it was coming through this town. And during that fire, more than 100 people sheltered here because traffic out of town wasn't moving. So those people owe their lives to this park. When TNC heard this story, it got us thinking, you know, what if we were to develop more spaces like this? Could we intentionally develop spaces like this that protect people? Could more lives have been saved? And could we produce nature benefits too? And so as we thought about it, we came up with this concept. We're calling it Wildfire Risk Reduction Buffer, WRB for short, or just buffers for short. And this slide tries to illustrate how it works roughly. So this slide shows you development as we typically see it. And what we have is sort of this dark green left side is like the wildland area. And then the hatched lighter green area shows us where development typically ends up right up against those wildlands. But the idea with the buffer is let's not put our development right up against the wildlands. Let's zone that land for uses that can also act as a fire break. So maybe we get something that looks a little bit more like this. And what we had previously slated to be development is now a connected area of lands or buffer. And these lands are specifically managed for low fire risk. So land uses in this buffer area could include ag lands, parks, orchards, grazing areas, other uses. The main point is that they're actively managed for low fire risk and free of structures. And these areas are stitched together or connected, so they form a fuel break. But also importantly, they form a de facto urban growth boundary, which is important because the idea of these buffers, you know, they only have protective value for the community if development doesn't go leapfrogging across them. And so here I've circled in red leapfrog development that would put this buffer at risk. In addition to reducing the buffer's protective value as a fuel break, this kind of leapfrog development would also result in fragmentation and habitat loss in the wildland area. There's another benefit to these buffers though too, which is that they present an opportunity to have healthy fire. And we know that in many forest and grassland ecosystems that evolved with frequent, regular, low-intensity fire, low-intensity controlled burns can restore ecosystem health and reduce the possibility of severe fires by clearing out debris. So when we have development concentrated on one side of the buffer, it provides us an opportunity to do various, you know, fuel restoration techniques, land use, land management that actually encourages healthy, good fire. And finally, in this last picture of WRBs or buffers, you could get an idea for how buffers might look for multiple communities. On the far left, we have one community that has a buffer on the right-hand side, and that buffer is made up of ag land and golf courses. And then on the far right of the slide, we have another community, and it's got a buffer too, and it's got some ag land stitched together and some playing fields. And the corridor of wildlands in the middle is really cool because, first of all, it's like this great habitat corridor for wildlife, but also it can serve as an area for healthy fire. It can serve as a staging area for firefighters. So that's great. If we continue building in that area where the red circled areas are, we'd fragment that habitat connectivity and put the buffers at risk. So that's kind of the general idea behind buffers. Now, the work we're going to tell you about today, this came out of a paper that we released in December and actually built on some previous work that the Nature Conservancy did. And I just want to say all of what I'm about to tell you is really based on a case study that looks at Paradise. And of course, Paradise is very different from Santa Barbara. So just keep that in mind. But we'll talk a little bit about the end, and we can have some discussion if there's time afterward about, how this could look in different places. But thinking about Paradise, I'm sure you all remember the campfire. And it's crazy how long ago it was. Pandemic time is a little bit crazy, right? It feels both like a few years ago and a decade ago. And it may sound like old news after the last couple of wildfire seasons, but the campfire remains the deadliest fire in California history. It ignited early in the morning on November 18 of 2018, and it took fewer than 4 hours to rip through the town, where it killed 85 people. It destroyed over 18,000 structures. So this was horrific, right? And now, a few years later, Paradise is rebuilding, and they're thinking, how do we do this in a fire-resilient way? And the Nature Conservancy, we've also been thinking, how do we help create fire-resilient communities? And so we ended up partnering together with Paradise Recreation and Parks District and the Conservation Biology Institute. And what we did is to conduct a study to explore fire-resilient community design in Paradise. The study was completed in 2020, and it sets the foundation of the insurance work we've done more recently. So I want to try to walk us through it. What this study did is it asked the question, how much would fire risk in Paradise change over time? And specifically, how much would urban ignition risk from wildfire change if instead of building back on every parcel of land, the community used wildland adjacent parcels to construct wildfire risk reduction buffers? And so the first thing we did, of course, was science. The goal is to understand two things. First, is it really true that open space can function as a buffer against fires? And second, if it is, where are the places around Paradise that would be most affected by that function? So the first answer, or the answer to the first question is probably. Our team did a pretty extensive literature review and found that there's not a lot of scientific literature on buffer concepts, but there's a lot of anecdotal evidence. There's a lot of practical experience from firefighters and emergency responders who may not talk about these areas as buffers or label them as buffers, but do talk about them as shaded field breaks. So we do think there's a lot of potential for this kind of open space to really buffer against fires. And then the other question is, well, where are the places in Paradise that you could actually do this? And so for that second question, where are those places? We have a 3-step approach that we used to explore this. And I'm going to walk us through this in more detail, but I just want to sketch out as an outline in 3 steps first how this worked. So the first step was understanding what the risk of urban ignition is in Paradise by thinking about fire probability from the surrounding wildlands. Okay, so that's like step 1. The second step requires defining potential buffers or wildfire buffers. And each of these buffers is itself made up of individual parcels of land, and those parcels could be ranked or prioritized for fire risk reduction activities. Really, you want to think about doing activities on the highest priority parcels of land. And then the third piece of this is to simulate what happens if you do fire risk reduction actions on the ranked parcels. So if we actually go in and we simulate managing these parcels of land for low fire risk, how much does that change urban ignition risk in the town of Paradise? So that's sort of the brief sketch. Now let's walk through it with prettier pictures. First, what the team did is to map wildland fire probability. And so that's this figure you see on the left here, where we've got a bunch of pretty colors. The areas that have higher probability for wildfire are red, and the urban center of Paradise is the gray area in the middle. And so this was something using a scientific study from the literature, and I can pull up some details from that if people have questions, but basically this is a very science-based model. Now, connecting the dots from wildland probability to urban ignition risk is not just as simple as taking this map and drawing the next one, because thinking about urban ignition risk, what causes urban ignitions? Well, one is being adjacent to a flame front, but the second is wind traveling embers. And so what we had to do is actually pull in or integrate data from the Desert Research Institute on wind direction to help us connect the dots between this wildland fire probability and urban ignition risk. And when we pulled in both flame front data and this wind-driven ember data to help us understand what wind would do, we end up producing an urban ignition risk map, which is this map you see on the right-hand side. And so it's kind of interesting if you compare the far left figure and the far right figure, because if you look on the far left, the darkest shaded red area for wildland fire probability is like this lower left corner. But when you look at the urban ignition risk map, that's actually not where you see the greatest risk of urban ignition. It's actually sort of up on this kind of right-hand corridor of the map. And that's because of this wind issue and embers traveling roughly. So important to think about those details. Now, the next step to all of this, now that we have this urban ignition map, is to define some buffer zones. And so what our team did was to define 5 conceptual buffer zones around Paradise. And what we did to develop those, I mean, those were just defined using significant geographical features and vegetation. You can see them labeled on this map. So the little purple outlines show you where these 5 conceptual buffer zones are. And then within each of those buffer zones, we have parcels of land, and we analyzed and prioritized those as either medium or high for fire risk reduction actions. And so this prioritization that we did was based on fire risk, recreational and conservation value, and opportunities to aggregate parcels of land relating to land ownership or interest in land use change. And then the last step of this is to simulate risk reduction on the prioritized parcels and see how this changed the urban ignition risk in Paradise. So to do the simulation, our team defined 6 scenarios for risk reduction. And that's what the columns on this, or the rows on this table are here. So we've got 6 rows, and each one is a different scenario. And the 2 left columns, so the leftmost column here shows you which buffer or pair of buffers we're talking about doing management on. And then the next column over where it says high or medium priority parcels, that's telling you which parcels of land we were simulating risk reduction action on. So for example, if we look at this inner eastern scenario here, this means I've circled on the right-hand side on this map, I've circled our inner eastern buffer. And what this scenario says is I'm gonna go just to the high priority parcels and simulate risk reduction action, which is basically, I'm assuming in that simulation that if we change the land cover within that buffer on those parcels to a lower flammability use, like an irrigated parkland, then it's going to reduce the fire risk in that parcel. And then what the 2 right-hand columns are showing us here are a percent of acres that would be reduced for these parcels. So for example, so if I go into this inner eastern buffer and I undertake risk reduction action on just the high priority parcels, then all of for my land that's currently characterized as medium high ignition risk, it would actually decrease by 27%. And the amount of acres of land that are characterized as high ignition risk would decrease by 13%. Okay, so for each of these scenarios, you have the parcels of land you're acting on, and you have the amount by which acres of high risk land decreased, basically. And when we think about it that way, acres of high risk land decreasing is like a lower urban ignition risk. Okay, so that's kind of the rough idea. I know there's a lot to throw out. What actually turned out to be the most successful of these scenarios is working on this inner eastern buffer that we still have circled, but working on both high and medium priority parcels. So if we actually undertook risk reduction lands on both of those high and medium priority parcels, we reduced the number of acres that are medium risk by 36%, and we reduced the number of acres of land that are high risk by 64%. And so that translates into a pretty dramatically reduced urban ignition risk for Paradise. And what's actually kind of interesting here, if you look at, I know this is a lot of numbers to just sort of be staring at, but what's kind of cool is if you compare, so here's another scenario where we considered, what if you undertake risk reduction action on 2 buffers at once? What if you work on this inner and outer eastern? And I've circled both of those buffers in blue here. And what's interesting is that, at least for me, intuitively, I would think, oh, if I did risk reduction on 2 of these buffers, I should get a better benefit, right? But actually, the numbers show us that if you're only acting on the high priority parcels in both buffers, you don't get as much of a benefit as you do from acting on both the high and medium priority parcels in a smaller area. And that actually kind of makes sense because what we've seen anecdotally is that when you have this very carefully clustered buffer that's managed very tightly, you get more of a benefit. And so that's what we're seeing here in the data. So I know that was a lot of information, but let me try to pivot us a little bit now. Hopefully that made sense. And hopefully I've convinced you that wildfire risk reduction buffers have merit, but there's more to this story. And it's specifically about insurance. And I was pretty excited when I hopped on this call and heard you all talking about insurance, because it's something really big right now, right? When we're talking about strengthening community resilience to wildfire, insurance is something that really has to be part of that conversation, or it should be at the table. Insurance is something that's really important for community resilience. It supports rapid recovery from disasters like wildfires, and it can incentivize communities to take actions that reduce their risks. But as you're all aware, access to affordable insurance coverage is a big problem for a lot of Californians who live in the wildlands or in the wildland-urban interface area. And insurance is all about risk. And climate change, continued development in the WUI, all of those things increase risk. So there's kind of this dilemma of what do we do about this problem? And as we've been working on this buffer concept, we got to thinking, well, what if, how do risk reduction measures fold into the insurance piece of this? And is there a way that these buffers could actually make a difference? And so we ended up getting in contact with Marshal, who's an expert in strategizing about risk and has a subsidiary company, Guy Carpenter, that's a reinsurer. And so we worked with Marshal and Guy Carpenter to answer that question. And what we did is to take these buffer results that I just showed you from Paradise and think about how do we actually, quantify the benefits that you get in terms of insurance. Because the idea here is that if you're applying community or regional scale risk reduction mechanisms, you should be reducing your risk of loss. And in theory, that should mean that you're increasing the capacity of insurance to write insurance for homes in those areas. And so what we did with Marshal is we used something that's called a catastrophe model. And these are a tool that the insurance industry uses to estimate and manage the probability of loss posed by natural disasters and other catastrophic events. These are models that have been around for decades, but they gained a lot of prominence after Hurricane Andrew hit Florida in 1992. And they kind of evolved. I think at first they were based on, hurricanes, and then they folded in other kinds of convective storms, and then they started to fold in winter storms, and then finally wildfire got rolled into it. And over the last few decades, they've become an integral part of an insurance company's decision-making, its pricing, its underwriting, really how that insurance company is setting everything up. So these are really important. And the way that these catastrophe or CAT models for short work is that they take in what they call risk exposure information. And you can think about risk exposure, it's basically just like a collection of detailed information on a property. And when I say detailed, I mean really detailed, like we've got its spatial location, its spatial coordinates, structure specific characteristics, like what year was it built? What kind of roofing material does it have? Like what's the construction type of the house? And then it folds in things like reconstruction cost estimates. So if a structure were to be destroyed, how much would it cost to rebuild it? So this and other things, all of this exposure data gets fed into this catastrophe or CAT model. And the CAT model takes all that data, and what it does is it simulates a range of disasters over time. So we're really just sort of like saying, all right, we have this, this property, we're going to put it in this model and simulate what could possibly happen. And that produces this loss estimate. So what we did with Marshal was we collected exposure data, and some of that was data that Marshal had, and some of it was data that Paradise helped to provide, but we were able to provide a whole bunch of exposure data. And then we have our buffer information, and basically all the parcels of land that we fed into Marshal CAT model, they all were flagged based on where we had assigned them into a buffer. So we were able to keep track of the buffering process as we went. And here's what we ended up finding. So we did a couple of simulations. Actually, let me go back a slide here. So with this CAT model, we ended up doing two different kinds of basically event simulation. One assumed that you have, you feed in this data and then assume that when a disaster comes or when the campfire comes, only 1,000 structures are rebuilt. We called that the partial rebuild scenario. And then we did another study where we assumed that all the structures that had been destroyed were rebuilt. So this first set of figures here, this is what we're seeing as the results for this partial rebuild scenario. And I know there's a lot going on in this plot, so let me try to explain. So what you're looking at are two different summary metrics from the CAT model. And for each of these metrics, we have a baseline scenario. That's the dark blue box on the far left. And that dark blue box is showing you paradise without any kind of buffers. And then the other 6 colored bars are showing you those same 6 buffer scenarios that we looked at earlier, where if you remember, our best performing buffer scenario was that inner eastern buffer where we acted on both high and medium parcels of land. And the top box here, this top plot that says AAL, AAL is something that stands for average annual loss. So this is the expected loss per year averaged over many years. And then the bottom box shows you a loss that's ranked a little bit differently. It's estimated on an occurrence or on a single event basis. And in this case, a 1 in 250 year event. So top is average annual loss, and the bottom panel is this 1 in 250 year event. And what you can see is that, if you compare the boxes just to the baseline, all of these are much lower. And what that's telling you is, hey, we're talking about a lot less loss. So the loss impact in paradise from putting these buffers in is pretty profound in this partial rebuild scenario. But this partial rebuild scenario is where we assume that paradise only rebuilds with 1,000 structures. And what's challenging here is that, if we look back at the CAT model and how the CAT model worked, you're feeding in the CAT model this exposure data that's based on how many structures you have. If paradise only rebuilds 1,000 structures, you don't have as much exposure. So it makes sense that these numbers would be lower. And so this is why we ended up doing this full rebuild scenario. It's sort of like if you think about every structure being rebuilt, it's a more conservative estimate. Paradise isn't likely to rebuild every structure that was built, but it gives us a way to disentangle how much of this loss impact reduction comes from the buffers alone. And it gives us essentially the sense of the potential benefit to paradise if the buffers had been adopted prior to the campfire. And so what we see here is that the average annual losses still decrease for all of the buffering scenarios by a range of anything from 25 to 42% based on the scenario that we implement. And for this inner eastern buffer with the high and medium parcels of land, that was like our favorite best performing buffer, that basically takes a 1 in 100 year loss level to a much more rare 1 in 350 year loss level. So the point of all this, I know this is just like a lot of figures and data, but the point is these buffers make a substantial difference in terms of loss. And what that means is that we really have the potential here for a win-win-win situation for communities, for insurers, and for nature. We end up having this situation where if we can reduce loss impact, we can reduce losses for the insurer, suddenly they're able to provide coverage where maybe they couldn't before. That's a win for the community. That's a win for the policy holder, right? So there's big insurance implications here. There's another really interesting insurance aspect of this too. I don't know if any of you have heard about this, so I'm pretty excited to tell you about it if you haven't. When TNC first started doing this work with Marshal McLennan, we wanted to explore whether the buffer strategy in paradise could be a way to implement a new concept called community-based insurance, or sometimes called community-based catastrophe insurance. Same thing. So community-based insurance, or CBI, this is an innovative framework where a community scale entity, could be a local government, could be a special district, it arranges for insurance protection for its members. And there's a few different ways that could look. It could mean that the community actually purchases the policy for the community. It could be where the community decides to pursue their own insurance. There's several different ways it could look. It's very flexible, and this is all conceptual. It's like a brand new concept that's never been actually done yet. And so a lot of different ways it can look. But basically the idea is this community scale entity helps to arrange for insurance protection for its members. And there's a whole bunch of benefits to the approach, but the two that kind of jump out from our point of view, first of all, this community-based notion, it really allows for risk reduction measures that are happening across the community to actually be reflected in insurance. And that's something big, right? Because I think up until pretty recently, in fact, right now, if you have a fire safe community or fire-wise community, maybe your community is undertaking a whole bunch of risk reduction measures. Those aren't necessarily, they may, but they may not be reflected in your insurance premium, right? And certainly that's true for homeowners. We have lots of instances across California where homeowners are doing home hardening and they're trying to undertake all these measures, but that's not being reflected in their policy. And so one of the strengths of this approach is that it provides a way for the community to have their collective risk reduction activities actually sort of play out into the insurance world. And what that means, not only is that possibly they get a premium reduction, but it also means that we're incentivizing communities to undertake these risk reduction actions. And that's big. The other powerful piece of this is just that we've collective bargaining. When you go to the insurer as a community, instead of as a single person trying to get a policy that's underwritten for you, you have more bargaining power. So there's potential here to really make an impact on, people's access to insurance and their coverage for insurance. So like I said, this is a very new idea. There's this really great report that Marshall McClendon put out on it that's online, and they kind of walk through, hey, here's a couple of different ways we think this could actually look in practice, but nobody's done it yet. But this is an idea that's catching attention. The Department of Insurance has thought about it. Certainly TNC and other NGOs are thinking about it. And actually this session just a month or two ago, Senator Dodd in the legislature authored this bill that's kind of related. And so it's an evolving space, and we don't exactly know how it's going to play out yet. But if it's something that sounds interesting to you, I would say stay tuned and stay in touch, because we think there's a lot of potential here. So I want to give us plenty of time for questions. Let me just summarize with some of the key findings that we had here. The first is just that implementing buffering strategies like these WRBs, or wildfire risk reduction buffers, significantly reduces loss impact for communities. If the buffer strategies had been paired with building code updates prior to the Camp Fire, potential losses could have been reduced by as much as 42%. That's huge, right? Especially if we're talking about 5. So that's really important. The second piece, not all these buffering scenarios are created equally. And the first chunk of this talk, I was walking us through maps and science bits, right? There's a lot of groundwork that has to go into this, a lot of careful analysis and modeling that are needed on local spatial scales to understand what the potential risk reduction benefits are, where there is land that's sensible to do this kind of thing, how much does it cost? Really, probably cost benefit cost analysis would be needed to really explore it. It's something we didn't have capacity to do for Paradise, but I think as communities think about this idea, it's important to consider that. The third point here is that in addition to these loss impacts, and I think I forgot to say this earlier, if you fold in home hardening and other risk reduction measures with the buffers, you get even better benefits. It's certainly not an either or approach. We're definitely not saying that communities should put in buffers at the expense of any other kind of risk reduction measure. The idea here is it's like a yes and approach. We need all the tools in the toolbox. And so if we compare all of these risk reduction tools together, then we get big benefits. I guess I had that point repeated twice. Whoops. And then just the last point, this new notion of community-based insurance, it's one possible way we can actually capture financially the benefits of these collective resilience efforts. So just as a last note here, all the work I just shared focused on Paradise as a case study, but we do think it could be replicable in other communities and in other parts of the state. But there are details we're still thinking through. So for example, a buffer might look completely different in Southern California than it does in Paradise. It's really important to think about the potential impacts a buffer might have on adjacent wildlands. And, buffers, some of my colleagues really don't like us to call them nature-based solution, because the buffers themselves, if you're thinking about putting in a soccer field, you're not really providing a lot of nature benefit in terms of biodiversity or habitat. You're really providing a benefit by providing an urban sprawl boundary. And so it's important to carefully consider the trade-offs that come with losing our wildlands to constrain and protect the community, and think about sort of these various pieces that go into it. It all comes back to this idea that, we humans can't survive without healthy natural systems around us. And so again, the tagline, when we protect nature, nature protects us. And as we think about using strategies like this, we really got to ground ourselves in that to make sure we're doing it right. So I just wanted to sort of put that out as a thought point, or a seed for thought, that we're still trying to understand what this would look like in a place like Santa Barbara, which is completely different ecology than Paradise. So anyway, okay, I'm going to stop with that. Thank you for letting me share this work, and I'll do my best to try to answer any questions you might have.
Wow, thank you, Sydney. Very well thought out, thorough report, very enlightening. Very good job. I'm sure everybody's got a lot of questions for Sydney.
Yeah, it looks like I see Christina's hand up.
Christina? Then Joan?
Hi, Sydney. Wow, what a wonderful presentation. And I just have to compliment the Nature Conservancy on being so proactive about how to address paradise after the tragedy, and working with Cbci and doing all the things that you've done. I was trying to kind of educate myself about it during the, some of the research on the regional priority plan that we did. But one of the things that I learned during that was the buffers that were envisioned as part of this project for Paradise were really working directly in conjunction with a very willing parks director who was excited about creating the buffer and things. And I just wanted to ask if you had any suggestions about how to think about this in areas where maybe there isn't that existing kind of area that could be considered for a buffer, just individual outreach to landowners, or how has Nature Conservancy approached that?
Oh, that's such a great question. And actually you hit on something important, which is, there's sort of different scenarios in which you can envision using the buffers. So there's Paradise that's rebuilding after a fire, right? And that's certainly been the case in other California communities too. But that's a different scenario than either planning a brand new development or looking at existing development that hasn't burned, right? They're kind of like three separate different pictures. And right now, the Nature Conservancy, we're still kind of trying to wrap our mind around how this could work for an existing community that isn't rebuilding after a fire. Because right now what we see is communities that are interspersed into the WUI, and there's not necessarily distinct boundaries where it's clear where you put in these buffers. And then, like you said, how do you approach landowners? And so these are, I wish I had a concrete answer to your question, but what I can tell you is that these are the questions that keep me awake at night and that we're still grappling to try to figure out. And I think it's a combination of things. I guess what I would say is to make the buffers work, and certainly with the insurance piece of it work, you really need to have three enabling conditions. One is to have an area where you have insurable assets. The second is to have political willingness to do the buffers. And that's kind of where you get into this piece of how do we acquire the land to manage it. What is the third piece? Why am I spacing out on this? There's a third piece, but I can't think of what it is on my head.
Insurance.
I don't remember where I was going with it, but I think there's a few different ways to think about it. That's what it was. The community has to have the actual financial resources to acquire the parcels of land in theory, right? And so at least that's how we've been thinking about it. There's other possible ways to put the buffers in. It could be that, actually we had a conversation with Dan Staff at Paradise Recreation and Parks District a couple of weeks ago. And he was talking about there's a lot of landowners there who are thinking, I don't really want to rebuild on my parcel of land. Let me talk to the community. Can we turn it into a park? And so there's actually a lot of people who are interested in that. And he mentioned one specific property owner who I think wants to keep their parcel of land, but is like open to the idea of, hey, well, I'll enter into some kind of an easement strategy with you where we manage the land in the right way. So I don't think you necessarily have to acquire or purchase the parcels of land, but there does have to be some kind of a land management agreement or an easement or some kind of a collective agreement, because the key for the buffers to work is that they can be managed for low fire risk. And you also want them to be connected, right? And so I think for any given community, the first piece is like figuring out, well, where would we even put the buffer? And that's where all that science and groundwork goes in. And then the second piece of figuring it out with landowners, that's just going to have to be a lot of conversations, I think. But great question.
Great. Joan, and then Victoria.
Well, I had a question and a comment. So first, my question, could you elaborate a little bit more on how the collective insurance goes? So the entity doesn't self-insure, it's engaged in collective bargaining with traditional insurance companies. Is that it?
Yeah, that's roughly the idea. So there's this great report that Marshal McLennan put out, and they have this table in it that has like 4 different methods. So nobody really knows exactly how it could work. There's a couple of different ways it can work. One is like, it could be really hands-off where the community helps to arrange coverage for its members, or it could be hands-on where the community actually sets up its own captive insurance company It could be offered as a voluntary community benefit, or it could be a requirement of community membership. So there's like a lot of different ways this can look. And actually, I kind of want to I almost want to pull this document open. Let me just find this really quick because I'd love to just show you all this. Let me just find this table really fast. Okay, share screen. Okay, hopefully you're seeing this. I know it's kind of small.
Yes.
So this is what we're looking at here is this community-based catastrophe paper that I pointed out. And they have this figure that they call Cbci delivery models. And so these are the different ways the insurance sector is thinking about, like, they're thinking, well, how would this look? And you can see there's these different approaches. And I think the one that TNC has thought the most about is sort of this group policy idea where you have some kind of community structure. It could be local government, it could be a special district, we're not really sure. But that community level entity goes to the insurer and then helps to arrange for the group policy on behalf of their members, almost like the same way that you think about like health insurance benefits or something like that. But there's these other three models too. And so nobody really knows how it will look in practice, but everybody's thinking, how do we do it? And Senator Dodd's bill that I mentioned in my talk would create a new kind of special district that he's calling a climate resilience district. And we think that it could be the perfect kind of institution for this group policy idea where you put in these climate resilience districts and those help to arrange for the policy. And what's cool about this, I'll stop sharing this, is that if you actually capture the insurance benefits of the risk reduction and lower insurance premiums, then the money from that savings can actually get rolled over into paying for the land management that supports the buffers. At least that's the idea.
Ah, the O&M. Well, I just wanted to let people know that countywide, we're doing a recreation master plan that also includes the 8 cities within our county. And we're working now with TPL to think about a bond measure, perhaps in 2024. And one aspect would be these buffers. So we're thinking forward about this.
Oh, that's great. And I'd be, if any, this goes for anyone here, if you're interested in having more conversations after this call, please reach out to me. We'd be happy to keep having conversations as we're figuring all this out.
Awesome. Victoria, and then Phil and Ted. You're muted, Victoria.
Okay, I live in a community that has a buffer. In 1962, an open space was assigned to our community for its development, and that open space has been there since 1962. It was disrupted by the Painted Cave fire in 1990, which came down our canyon and burned houses within 2 houses of my own. And 30 years after that, finally, Rob Hazard, the great star of county fire, as a fire marshal, finally cut the grass on our open space after 30 years. And when they did that, they found scar from Painted Cave fire. So as is true with most good science, it's elegant and parsimonious. It tells the truth. Your study tells the truth, but the aspect of maintenance is so important, because you can have an open space which is dedicated to the community, but if there's no money or resources to maintain that space or to cut down the brush, your fire risk not only doesn't decrease, it can increase. So I need to see in all these proposals some kind of an acknowledgement that maintenance, is essential to the solution, using open spaces as a protector, as buffer districts for WUI communities.
That is such a great point, and one that really, really resonates. I mean, absolutely to the point. These don't work unless they are managed for low fire risk. And these buffers, like I said, they don't produce a lot of habitat or biodiversity benefits. The benefit is the risk reduction. So if you don't manage the land and you lose that risk reduction value, you're really not helping nature or people. But maintenance is really important. We see this in other nature-based solutions too. So one of the, outside of wildfire, one of the things I work on is thinking about urban tree planting for extreme heat. And it's very similar, where often there are funds available for tree planting, but no funds available to communities for tree maintenance. And it's like, well, no good if you can't maintain it. And so I think that's where the power of the insurance business comes in, because it's like, great, buffering strategies are great, but how is the community over the long term going to be able to manage and sustain that? And what we think is that if you could reduce premium, if you could get these savings from insurance, we think those could be rolled into that. But we still got to work out the details more. Absolutely.
Great question, Victoria. Yeah, Phil and then Ted.
I was really intrigued by, calling these areas buffers. Traditionally we've thought about fire protection, we think of fuel breaks. And unfortunately that creates expectations on both ends. I think a lot of environmental people are shy about fuel breaks because they think it's going to be kind of a clear cut, a habitat desert. And a lot of people that are just worried about fireside want it to be a clear cut. So having, areas that are designated in buffers and kind of managed in a way that, is fire resistant, but not necessarily, overkill as far as vegetation removal and everything, and it has park-like qualities, I think that makes it a lot more appealing, and probably doable in terms of public support, financial support, getting water there to keep things irrigated, because as we all know, fuel moisture is a critical factor. The other thing I wanted to ask is, right now the insurance commissioner has published draft, regulations that are going to require insurance companies to, take into account individual, defensible space and home hardening factors. Have you looked at those, and is, this concept of, having buffered areas, is that addressed in those regulations?
That's a great question. I actually just came across those regulations. I mean, I think they came out about a month ago, or a little bit less than a month ago. And I was pretty excited to see it. I think, it's critical if we want to incentivize people to undertake risk reduction. It makes sense that you want to see that get reflected in your insurance premium. I don't know that buffering is folded into that yet. So that's a great question that I don't know the answer to, but one that I'm very keen on learning the answer to. But what I will say is that, the Department of Insurance, they have this working group, it's called the SB 30 working group, which was convened by a piece of legislation that Ricardo Lara put out when he was still in the legislature. And this working group has been looking at different strategies to address climate change with insurance. And one of the areas they focused on is wildfire. And one of the things they suggested in that report, or in the report they were produced, was this notion of community-based insurance. And they talk about land management there too. So I do know it's something that the Department of Insurance is thinking about. Whether it's in those regulations, I'm not totally sure, but I plan on finding out. So I'm glad you raised that point.
Great. And then in the chat, Joan brought up a good point. We've had experience in our South Coast as far as orchards being a buffer. And then that puts an onus on the actual owner of the orchards just to maintain them. But that is a huge part of our South Coast, especially Goleta, is orchards. So thank you for that, Joan. So Ted, you're next. And then Ray.
Yeah, well, I think Phil kind of covered some of what I was going to ask, but for many years, we live in a rural community surrounded by mostly by national park or actually the Forest Service. We've considered and tried and actually put into effect some of the buffer zones that you're discussing, but the biggest pushback that we've gotten, and I think Phil touched on this, is from the environmental community, because it's very difficult to clear brush and it still not have any effect on the habitat, et cetera, et cetera. And I'm just wondering, I'm sure that you've considered this at the Conservancy. I'm wondering how you go about addressing the environmental aspect of it.
That's such a great question, and actually one that I'm sort of living through on a day-to-day basis, and in meetings with my peers, because I'm obviously like a champion for this idea, but there are certainly some concerns on the environmental side. I think one of the biggest concerns actually is that I mean, what we've seen in the past is situations where developers look at like the success of home hardening and then basically say, oh, well, as long as we just harden our homes and use better building materials, we can just build anywhere we want. And then that continues the sprawl, right? And we don't want to see that repeated with buffers where developers think, oh, if we just put a buffer around everything, it's going to be fine. We'll keep on sprawling everywhere. That's a very valid concern that a lot of my colleagues have. And that's when we still, I think this comes back to there being different scenarios where you implement a buffer. It's like, are you thinking about implementing it around an existing community, around a new community that's being built, or around a community that's rebuilding after a fire? And I think each of those scenarios is different. And right now, the way we're internally thinking about it is trying to sort of tease out when it would make sense to do this. But certainly for a situation where you're rebuilding after a fire, I think that's the clearest situation where you can alleviate some of those environmental concerns, because you're talking about land that already was developed. So it's already sort of been degraded from a natural standpoint. But now you're talking about putting a park on it, which is better than putting a house on it. So that sort of, I don't know, that kind of gets at your question, but it's tricky. And I think the other piece of this is in having these conversations, I think it's important to have the Enviro folks at the table to help understand. It's like the benefit of the buffer in terms of the environmental side is that you're providing an urban growth boundary. Frankly, that's the benefit. I mean, you're not providing habitat benefit in the buffer. You're not, like, an irrigated soccer field does not have biodiversity benefits, right? But what you are getting as a benefit is this urban growth boundary. And so I think what has to be done is to really carefully think through the trade-offs. What are the trade-offs between having this urban growth boundary that constrains the community now, but versus losing that little, wedge of habitat, for example? And so I think it's just going to come down to looking at each location. Like, each location is different. Southern California is totally different from Northern California. And actually, my colleagues in Southern California got pretty upset at the idea of an irrigated soccer field in the buffer for a number of reasons that we could get into, but they suggested alternatives like land grazing. And so I think for each community, it's going to be important to think about the various trade-offs and the way that buffer could be used in a way that also supports adjacent wildlands.
Great question.
So just one more point that Sydney brought up, and I'd like to address, is the fact that these buffer zones are not only protecting the community from the wildfire, but they're also protecting the wildlands from fires that are started in the communities, which much more often occur or do occur quite often. And I think that that's something that is a talking point there that isn't really touched on very much.
I hadn't even thought of that. And I'm really glad you raised it. We have all those news stories of like people's gender reveal parties for their babies, right? Igniting horrible fires. So I think that's a great point.
Thank you for that question. Yeah, there's a couple in the chat. Nick made a good point about RWMP. He's already kind of analyzing that same situation. And then Joan had a quick question. Maybe Sydney, you could touch on that. Then we'll go right to Ray and Gordon. I think we'll have to cut it off at that point so we can move on.
And Joan, it looks like your question maybe is directed at Nick, which is really interesting. I'd be curious about that too, because I think the way that there, this analysis that we did with Cbci, we came up with this 3-step model to understand where you'd put the parcels. But I imagine that there could be other factors that apply in other locations. So I'd be curious to hear what Nick thinks.
Great. Ray, and then Gordon.
I would just like to point out that the Mission Canyon Association is working with the Botanic Garden and Max Martz to put to try to create an oak buffer at the top of the canyon. And I would add to that much of the front country at one time was oak woodland. And in a sense, the chaparral is an invasive species that took over after the oaks were cut down. So we need to go back to some more oaks, which are more protective for the communities than the chaparral.
The chaparral,
thank you, Ray.
Definitely unique. Challenging.
Gordon?
Thank you very much. What a great roundtable, and just very impressive. I'd like to introduce Liz Alves, who's a Trial Club member. She's joined our Firewise meeting, and she's also very active on the Firewise committee here in the Trial Club. Welcome aboard, Liz. And she does represent one of those, I want to say 40s 40-year-old community that's moved into the Trial Club with the ability to buy homes up here, and very successful professional class that we welcome here in the Trial Club. And thank you, Anne-Marie, for bringing our Firewise status to fruition. And we're working on these buffer zones, and this is stuff we've been working on, and we want to work as a community to be in a position to actually have a community-based plan that will help everybody, both in safety as well as cost of insurance. I just want to share on a personal note, we are in a wildfire risk category of 15 here in the Trial Club, number 8. And we've been hardening our homes since 2008 with the Gap Fire that almost came into the Trial Club. And we're very far along the line of home hardening. It takes years and a lot of expense to get there. Rob Hazard's seen our sprinklers in action, and some of you may have also. We'll be doing a demo. Susie and I will be doing a demo sometime in May, and maybe in conjunction with the event weekend for the San Marcos Pass community and the Trial Club to see how these sprinklers turn our property into a rainforest in about 10 minutes, and very significant with our own stored water and system of sprinklers. So my insurance company, private, I've had it for years, dumped me a few times last year. I lobbied and lobbied with reports on the hardening of the home, and managed to keep it. And this year, again, we've managed to officially keep it. They're only insuring from 0 to 3 on a risk factor number. 0 to 3, but we are at an official 15, and we have very high quality, excellent coverage at a very reasonable price with an established company, and we're very fortunate. And it's the home hardening here that we've done. And I just want to be encouraging that insurance can be worked. We're at a point now where obviously a lot of people are looking at it. And the more we can do, the better chances we have to not be stuck in the trap of the California FAIR Plan with insurance rates that are only going to escalate. Thank you very much for this opportunity.
Great, thanks for it. And thank you, Liz, for coming on our call and being part of our community. I think it was Nick that made a good point about the CWPPs and how this might affect that. So both Scotts, I know you're on the call, Scott Ecker and Scott Coffin, let's make sure we address that. What Nick's question is there. We don't have to necessarily have anything to talk about at the moment, but just pay attention to that. So any other quick question regarding this? And then Sydney, it'd be great if you could stick around, because our next speaker, Fred Tan, our Assistant Fire Marshal, is also going to be discussing the insurance aspect. So it'd be great if you could hang around for a while for that.
Absolutely, thanks. And I will post links to the various reports in the chat too. Perfect,
thank you. Any other quick question regarding Sydney?
I was gonna just put it in the chat box, so I didn't take up the time. I just wanted to know what happens to parcels that are owned by people, for example, in the Paradise Fire. And if they decide to take this buffer zone approach, what happens to the land, the properties that would be needed to create that buffer zone? Would homeowners be compensated for their land or what?
Yeah, I think the idea would be to acquire the parcels of land by actually sort of like a buyout, really, right? Where the community comes in and they purchase the parcel of land and then they maintain it. But the tricky part with that, the hard part, and I think where Paradise struggles too, is like the community has to have enough resources to do that. And not all communities, especially rural California communities, may not have that ability. So we're also considering strategies where maybe the landowner keeps their land, but agrees to manage it in a certain way. So a couple different ways it could work.
Thank you. Thank you for this excellent presentation, Sydney.
Thanks for the chance to be here.
Yes, thank you so much, Sydney, and thank you so much for staying. Anything we can do to help you with your, future reporting and applications, just let us know. So moving on, let's move on to Fred, our Assistant Fire Marshal. local lessons learned from insurance. Fred.
All right. Hi, everyone. Good to see you. Well, everyone's at home. Does anyone need a break? I guess you guys can take your breaks when you need. Let's see. Do I have the ability to share screen, Paul? Screen share, I do. All right, perfect.
There you go.
All right, good. Well, so I was asked to just to present a case study, and I'll try to leave as much detail out. I should have probably approached the homeowner about this to let them know I was going to use them as a case study. But I was going to discuss, you know, from the perspective of the fire department, the homeowner, the fire department's capacity, our specific one to be able to handle issues like this, what our history is, what this homeowner went through, especially difficult process. And I don't really actually even know what the end result was. I know that we were dealing with this for several months, and a lot of phone calls, a lot of emails, a lot of late night emails. And then after I submitted a letter, things had just kind of quieted down. So I'm hoping they're successful. I probably will reach out to them, and maybe depending on what, depending on the answer, or even if it's a negative answer, I'll pass that along for the next meeting to let you know what happened. So, so we were engaged as a deputy fire marshal, and I work for Rob. In our office, we have several shops and several different disciplines. One of our shops, and one of my captains, he's in charge of planning and development. In the planning and development section, they could assist the county, other jurisdictions like Buellton, Solvang, Goleta that don't have, where we are their fire department. We are giving them conditions to build homes or developments. We will engage, whether like in Rice Ranch right now, there's several developments from 40 homes to 160, and we'll make comments on roads, maybe secondary access, width of the roads, how many hydrants, where the hydrants are at, the flow rates of the hydrants. Then after that infrastructure is built, then we'll discuss defensible. Defensible space is also a topic in that part of development. And then after that, we will just, as we go to the homes, we'll discuss whether they, all the homes per state law will need sprinklers. We test the sprinklers out. We issue a dressing. And there's a lot of nuances to as far as building homes that subsequently the inspectors will go out on. One of the things that shop does per county code is issue addresses for any new structure that gets constructed. Could be a mini mall that they split a previous unit into 2 units, and now that unit needs an address. Everything comes through the fire department so that we can put it in what we call a centerline file, and then in an address numbering system that makes sense. In a lot of urban areas, like in New York City, you'd have First Street, and then a first, maybe an Avenue A. First Street would be 100 block, and then Second Street would be the 200 block, and they go sequentially. And that's how I was trained when I was a young firefighter. Like, okay, well, you need to go to 1300 Apple Street. Well, I'd go 2 blocks up on this road, and then it's 13 blocks down because it's 1300 block. So that, and I kind of go into in depth a little bit on that process, because that's how we got engaged in this. The planning and development section, an application was turned in to address a building. And we typically only address buildings that we consider that are habitable, that people are living in. We don't typically address barns, storage units, storage sheds. we will address accessory dwelling units where people are living in, junior accessory dwelling units. But in this case, there was a fairly long, drawn out process with the applicant to address a barn. And it got to the point where several weeks, several emails, several phone calls happened. And it just hadn't met the standard. It wasn't a living space, it was a barn. It was one of the nicest barns I've ever been in. It was Chapter 7A construction, fire resistive roofs, fire resistive siding, had a hydrant about 75 feet from it. I would live in it, but I just couldn't give it an address, you know? So as we met with the homeowner, what we found was she wanted the address because of insurance reasons. And she had read that the applicant, she actually was an NFP, I think she's retired, but a retired NFPA attorney, writing laws for them, you know, writing draft laws for them, engaging in lawsuits to get laws into place, you know. So already pretty daunting as I walk up with my captain. And she's like, yeah, this is, you know, we discussed what's happening. We spent a couple hours out there. Mind you that this application fee is only $40, and we've spent several weeks, and on this occasion, probably 2 hours of staff time for myself, a captain, and an inspector to discuss, to get to the point where we are trying to understand what's happening. But she, as an attorney, she has read in the documentation that I forget the word, and I'll pull up the document, but that essentially what she thinks they mean by a structure, she's equating that to be something that's addressed, and that's why she's fighting so hard for it, because she'd gotten a letter that just for the 3 structures on her property, she has 3 structures on her property, but the previous year she was able to get insurance for all 3 structures, all really solid properties, including her home. But on this, for this particular year, they were going to charge her $94,000 just for her main residence. And let me see what I have here to show the group. So I'm going to pull up a map. I thought I had it up here already, but bear with me as I log in. My apologies for the delay. I was just educating our academy, our new academy, on fire prevention, and using this for another presentation. So let's see. Okay, data is not pulling up here. All right, I'm gonna share screen. Sorry, guys. There we go. So the applicant received a letter. They received a letter on 2 properties out on her parcel. This one here towards the bottom, and these 3 here, which is addressed off of this main residence in the center. And they were going to take away the insurance on it because they didn't know where hydrants were, and they didn't feel that there was adequate hydrants, and that fire history in that area would justify the $94,000 a month property or insurance rate for the year for just this parcel here. The barn that she had wanted to address was over here. And it, like I said, there's a hydrant here where my cursor is. There is quite a bit of topography in this area, but this is the San Ynez Valley, which is characterized by a lot of rolling hills, light fuels, and a lot of homes that are really well hardened. You know, there was some concern that the property owner had that this parcel over here had grass that hadn't been mowed. And, you know, just based on her construction site, based on the history of like very low history of fires in this area, you know, I was pretty comfortable to say there was low fire risk. I think this is a moderate fire risk area. And I'll show you some of the documents that she had presented to us that were kind of problematic, that we kind of identified pretty quickly that may have had some inaccurate data. So, okay. So typically when we engage in an insurance issue, once this opens, a lot of homeowners and residents will call us and say, our insurance company is looking for this data. Sorry, we can see names, whatnot here. We're looking for this data. What the local fire department is, what the capacity is, how many engines may show up, how many hydrants are within a certain amount of feet, what are the road conditions, what are the roads made of, what types of fire engines would come in, and this questionnaire will keep my planning and engineering captain fairly busy. You know, he probably gets about 5 of these a week, and they're getting a little bit more difficult, a little bit more detailed to complete. And this one is like, in the event of a wildland fire, what actions are taken to reduce the risk near this location, and what actions are taken for the during a wildland response. I completed this because I was doing the report for the resident that had the issue with insurance. You know, it took me about an hour staff time to get this data, complete it, make sure it was something that the insurance companies would look at and look favorably upon. So this is typically the document that we'll see. They usually always ask for an ISO rating, and I'll mention this to the group here. We can't comment on the ISO ratings because it is a proprietary product. Insurance companies should have that. So that's usually what we're telling insurance companies. We can't provide you ISO ratings. We have had our hands slapped in the past because we have provided that to someone and we didn't know that it was something that insurance companies paid for. So that's typically the document that we do. We'll do at the request of a homeowner. Historically, it takes about 15 minutes. This one took a little bit longer. But based on, this is the letter that that the homeowner and the resident received. Sorry. Okay. And the reasons why they were getting denied insurance. The reason they were getting denied insurance was because of a couple of reports that they had generated through the Red Zone Wildfire, a company called Red Zone, that puts their property in, that locates their property and then locates fire history around it, talks about and makes a judgment essentially on their fire risk of this property. You know, if we look back, you know, Chief Hazard's probably chomping at the bit to jump in, but this, you know, I would put firefighters at any of these properties in the San Ynez Valley any day of the week, with these conditions, with the light fuels, even with the topography, with the combined condition of light fuels, the construction, the defensible space, the roads that act as buffers, you know, generally not heavy winds, you know, the absence of chaparral, that just north of this house that serves a community. This is I think this was a 300,000 gallon tank of water. You know, I think there was a lot of things kind of going for these parcels in this community, and for them to ask for $94,000 a year, you know, obviously, I think in most of our opinions was one, unaffordable, two, just inappropriate, I think, for them to ask for. But that's a business they're in. So this is as an example, this is one of the documents that was provided to that property. So the Wildland Risk Report, created September 20th, 2020, creates the lat and long for their parcel, puts them in the map on the left is I don't think that's a high fire. It could be, but maybe that's their own. I'm thinking that is their own fire hazard mapping, but it is pretty close to the high fire hazard area. And they point to these fires, which they point to these fires as risk factors for that property. And the Alamo fire, which well, that's a 2003 Alamo fire, which was 7.5 miles away. The Gaviota, 10 miles away. Whittier fire, which is nowhere near this home. The Sherpa fire on the other side of the Camino. It just kind of inappropriate examples of what might affect this parcel and this community. And, you know, when you look at these fires, they're in what we call, most of them are, we have a plan called the Fire Danger Operating Plan. And we've separated the county into 3 fire danger rating areas, 3 areas that have distinct like fuels, fuel types, climates, terrain, topography, and, you know, the fire danger rating area that these homes are in in a pretty unaffected FDRA. Most of these fires occurred in the other 2 FDRAs. And so as a result of doing this, you know, looking at this, at the homeowner's request, I ended up creating a document for her, including, I included the defensible space inspection results for those properties, which showed that they were compliant. Like this is the main home; it's compliant with all the documentation that is required by CAL FIRE, with a description of the construction features, tile roof construction, very fire resistive, eaves that are enclosed, stucco exterior siding, non-combustible deck porches. I mean, this thing's pretty bomb proof. you know, especially with the fuels that are surrounding it and the lack of hazardous fuels that are around it. So that was included in the document. And then this letter that I generated, which points to the FDRAs that this home is not in, based on the documents that they presented. Talked about the kind of lack of fire history in the surrounding area. The fire history that was in the surrounding area generally was pretty light, easy for us to catch and keep and contain. And we included the defensible space inspections within on the report, and also a map to, you can see the barn there. You can't really see the features, but it's fully hardened. And probably the only thing that's combustible is that frame for the awning.
Hey, Fred, yeah. We can't see we just still see the Google Earth.
Oh, really? Sorry, hang on.
Yeah.
Okay. All right. My apologies. Did you see the reports on the home? Probably.
No.
Okay. All right, thanks, Nick. Sorry about that. So this is the red zone wildfire report that was generated for that home in San Ynez. Shows the one map shows the fire hazard area that it's in. One map on the right shows a location, which you can see kind of the brown grass that's around it. But
we're still
not seeing it.
Not.
Fred, I think you have to stop screen share and reshare a new screen if it's not in that same Google window. Oh, now we see it. Okay. Yeah.
All right. My apologies. I know this. All right. So this is the report. Finally, that can you guys see that, the red zone report?
Yes.
All right. So this is the report that and there was two. Yeah, there's two reports that were attached to this property, and these are the fires that were pointed at that, like I said, that were in the two. Most of the fires were in the other fire danger rating areas, not in the milder fire danger rating area. That really didn't affect this home whatsoever, and I don't think justified the $94,000 annual bill. We'll just go real quickly to the report we generated for them, and so we had to generate a letter describing the FDRAs that are in my opinion that this house was defendable, had sufficient water sources, was extremely hardened, had no correlation to the fires that were pointed out in their report, and added the defensible space reports that we have done, that we had just done the year previous. Added a map that showed where the hydrants were, that the insurance company was they're questioning, and the nearest fire to this property, which was the Caballo fire, which is 70 acres in 2021, which we were able to contain fairly quickly last year. But that was, that is really the only near fire history in this area. And the Caballo fire did very little damage to the homes there. I know you guys are closing your meeting probably 5 minutes ago. I guess the point of this presentation was, is I think, the homeowners really are at a disadvantage here, and we feel the heartache. We can definitely feel the heartache when they get presented a bill of $94,000 and the feeling of scrambling to get your home that you've worked so hard to get insured so you can stay in it. For us, this confusion of the scrambling, creates a lot of staff work. If I had to generate one of these reports sufficiently, we'd probably have to have 5 of me and doing these 40 hours a week to cover our 17,000 homes in SRA. Maybe we could template it. At the end of the day, I think the hope probably is to educate the insurance companies about, the fire danger rating areas, the moderate to low fire risk neighborhoods such as these that they should be insuring, that the front country having all the fires, creating now a buffer for probably the next 10 years from the types of fires that are extremely destructive. I think, we have the conditions in the county that I think are really profitable. It could be really profitable for insurance companies. I don't know. I don't know what actions can be done. I think there are some people kind of lobbying the politicians in the state and working with insurance companies. One of my concerns would be people start, as $90,000 bills keep getting issued to these homeowners, that they could be, people just start leaving and then selling their homes at extreme discounts. And then that would hurt the county, that would hurt property owners and homes. And I apologize. I apologize for the technical errors there. I realize that probably wasn't as good a presentation, but that's kind of one of the real world scenarios that we've experienced here at County Fire.
Well, thank you, Fred, for that. I really appreciate you calling out that one, equation and one example, and what you've done to try to help that landowner. I mean, it's commendable, like with the letters and everything. And again, I'm sure there's way more than just this one. So thank you so much for that, Fred. Appreciate it. Any questions for Fred? Or any questions for Sydney regarding the same situation?
Paul, if I could jump in for a sec. I think, both are like incredibly important. And I just kind of wanted to say that the California Department of Insurance is receiving testimony on this upcoming, way they're going to redo the insurance April 13th at 1 p.m. And kind of one of the I think my pet peeves is the wildfire risk rating score, is just all over the map, like with Fair Plan, for instance. So trying to use something that's credible like PCR 4291 would be key. And there's a myriad of things that I think we need to do to improve the insurance regulations and that, but I've just kind of wanted to put out there the testimony coming up on April 13th at 1 p.m. And the other thing I'm just thinking, Paul, is that if we could come up with a letter from the Santa Barbara County Fire Safe Council would probably be really cool. So it's something we can discuss later, but in any case, it is coming up. So thanks.
Thank you for that, Scott. Anybody else have any questions regarding Fred's?
I just wanted to say, am I muted? Yeah, just wanted to thank Fred for that presentation. And it really points up that we're allies, that homeowners and residents can be allies with the fire department and vice versa about hardening homes, creating defensible space, and tackling insurance issues.
Thank you for that, Selden.
And I'll just, this is Rob. I'll just throw my quick 2 cents. What Fred's presentation really points out is that the insurance companies were basing this cost increase and this risk analysis on completely, on a completely bogus interpretation of fire risk in the San Ynez Valley, and looking at our pretty intense fire history and also misinterpreting the results of that data. So it was kind of, for me, I already knew that this was going on, but it was such a glaring example and kind of mind-blowing that an industry that mature, right? We've had insurance companies for many, many generations, and they've been insuring homes in California for a very long time. And they supposedly have all these people that go out and do risk analysis. And for them to misinterpret data to that extent is pretty mind-blowing. So it's not even the fact that they're gouging the homeowners, which they are, through either intent or faulty science, but it's also they're losing like this huge market share. Like, so just from a business standpoint, it blows me away. As a non-business person, government employee, almost my entire life, I find it mind-blowing that they are letting so many policies lapse in Santa Barbara County. I mean, just the Montecito foothills alone, it doesn't take a rocket scientist to look at the area and go, wow, for 20 years, you're not going to have any fire risk, essentially, because it's chaparral. And they should understand the risk factors of chaparral and fire return interval and how all that works. And the fact that they don't is pretty amazing. So this is the challenge that the fire service has right now. Everybody should understand that we really don't have control over these insurance companies. We'll give them input when they ask for it, but they're relatively disengaged from us. They used to be a lot more engaged. They used to actually call up the local fire station and ask questions about a residence in a certain district. But they don't even do that anymore. It's like they're just getting some kind of generic risk assessment that's not even using field data. They're just pulling up random data, somebody in an office in New York, and just going, no, there's too much fire risk, and saying it's valid, which is absurd. So I'd say, the answer right now, unfortunately, is that the homeowner has to go through this super long process with the fire department to try to rectify it.
Yeah, very frustrating. Yeah, frustrating for everybody, the fire department, and then also the landowners. Any other questions regarding this issue? Sydney, you want to have any foresight in that regard?
I don't know about foresight, but it's pretty helpful to hear. I don't know, just to be here and sort of hear this dialogue, because I'm so often talking to the insurance company and we're in the weeds about, this buffer strategy, but hearing how it's actually playing out on the ground is actually pretty powerful. And so it's really neat to be part of this dialogue, and thanks for including me today.
Thank you for coming and staying. I appreciate it. Anything else?
I just wanted to let Scott know I'd sure like the link emailed to us for that April 13th meeting that you were talking about for insurance. Anyway,
right. I can get that to you guys maybe in a separate email.
Yeah, maybe send it to Nick and he could send it out to everybody, or whatever you like to do, Scott. That'd be awesome.
Yeah, we'll get it to you.
The homepage of the website also has a meeting schedule that I try to put anything, even things that are webinars of interest to Fire Safe Council. I try to keep that regularly updated. So that's always a good spot too.
Thanks, Nick.
Welcome.
All right. So we're a little late, so sorry to keep everybody. Quickly, anything?
Thanks, Fred and Sydney.
Yeah, thank you guys for both coming and speaking. Very informative, great questions, good meeting.
Thank you, Fred. I was looking forward to getting together with you virtually when we have our Tepiscay VMP meeting coming up here shortly.
Will do. Yeah, we just started our project manager. The last couple of days I've been onboarding him, and we'll schedule something with you next week.
Okie doke. Thank you.